just to start off, I'm going to give you each 20 to 30 seconds. State your case. Monsieur Levy.
I feel compelled to give an opinion because I don't consider that making such a decision is only a UK decision. It has a lot of implications regarding the EU. I have been quite irritated that David Cameron has decided to play with this fantastic, great European dream just for internal purposes and the career path. I believe that this is a far too serious issue to just put his career as the key element of the decision. I think that UK should stay, and the damage will be much bigger for UK than for EU. And no, I don't want to play on the fears, but I believe that UK has always been an open country. You can go 1,000 years ago, and it has been always open to the world, and entrenching UK in an island would be a big mistake.
Lord Lamont.
Well, my reasons for wanting to leave are based on what the Prime Minister said on this very platform here when he made his Bloomberg speech, where he said the present situation in the EU was not satisfactory and it needed radical change. I'm sorry to say I don't think that that radical change was met. It was disappointing. And given that we didn't achieve what he thought was necessary then, I think on balance, not an easy decision, we ought to leave. I think also the issue of self-government is extremely important, and I'm sorry to see that's been excluded a bit from what we agreed originally on the debate. It is an issue even for people in the city just interested in markets. It's an important aspect.
Carolyn Fairbairn.
The CBI, we speak for thousands of businesses up and down the country in all sectors, and we've been talking to them now for over 2 years since the referendum first hit the agenda. And what they have been telling us repeatedly is that the value of the single market to market access, not just in the EU, but around the world through trade deals, is valuable. It's valuable for jobs, it's valuable for investment, it's valuable for the future prosperity of our country. And what they tell us is that they don't see any way of getting that same market access from outside the European Union.
John Moulton.
The UK needs out. We don't want to be a minor part of an economically crippling bureaucracy. We want free trade in Europe. We want friendly international relations with Europe and little else. Out's the right long-term place to be. This decision is all about the future. It's the long-term health of this proud nation.
Monti.
The European single market has been more than anything else a British Conservative Party construction, Prime Minister Thatcher, Lord Cockfield. It's slightly paradoxical that still under the Conservative aegis, the UK might decide to leave that huge benefit to the rest of us in Europe alone. Judging just from the point of view of the UK, I'm afraid there would be serious disadvantages for UK consumers, businesses, and for the UK as such in case of leaving. For consumers, because the benefits from the single market in terms of quality, prices, varieties would be wiped off to some extent. For businesses, for one reason in particular, governments, including UK governments, have the almost invincible temptation to play with subsidies and to distort competition. And through a strong competition policy and state aid policy that can be played, I'm sorry, out of Brussels, but by no means out of tiny London, it will be impossible to put the British companies on a domestic base and able to exercise a worldwide competition with a government which may play with subsidies. Finally, the UK would be losing an opportunity to be the real driver of the EU and of Europe rather than having considered that role exclusively to the beloved Germany.
Lord Lawson.
This is not about whether you like Europe or not. I love Europe, and indeed, my home is in France, and I'm flying back home tomorrow, or today, later today. But this is about the European Union and Britain's relationship with it. And the European Union is clearly an economic failure. This is partly because of the failure of the Eurozone, but it is a failure in other ways. It has a miserably slow rate of growth. It has very high unemployment and appallingly high in most of the European Union, including Mario Monti's Italy, another lovely country, appallingly high youth unemployment. But of course it's not an economic venture. So that's not all that surprising. It is a political venture. It always has been. My old friend, and he was my opposite number when I was Chancellor as French Finance Minister, Jacques Delors, was always clear that this was a political venture. And it's clear from the so-called Five Presidents report. Again, the purpose is to have a political union, a United States of Europe. That is not disreputable. I'm not saying it's disreputable at all. But it is not something which we wish to be part of. And it is crazy to be linked into and tied into a political project which we don't want to be part of, we don't agree with the objective, and something which is an economic failure. We will do far better with the freedom outside the European Union.
Lord Lawson, if you look at all the geopolitical concerns, be it in the South Asia Sea, be it China, be it Vladimir Putin and his Russia, are we not stronger politically as a bloc?
No, you're absolutely right that we should look at the global picture. And Britain does. Many European countries, and I know this very well from conversations I had in the ECOFIN Council when I was Chancellor, they look at things purely in the European context. Our context and our perspective always has been global. There's no country in the world which has more global links than we do. There is no city in the world which is more international than London, genuinely international. And through the English language, through the Commonwealth, through all our other links, we have a global perspective. And that is what is important looking ahead, both politically and economically. And to the little Europeans don't, for the most part, have that perspective.
John, would the City of London actually lose its status as international financial capital because the UK leaves the EU?
It might do it actually whether it stays in or it comes out. If it stays in the EU, it runs the risk of being gradually eroded with excess regulation, Solvency II, MiFID, AFIMD, potentially financial transaction tax.
Right.
All this kind of stuff which actually erodes the city's position. To a degree, it's economic warfare with Paris and Frankfurt. So staying in has a risk, coming out has a risk, but actually being different internationally in the financial markets can be a tremendous advantage. Look how London propelled itself in the 1980s in the financial markets, went hurtling past New York. That was because it was different, not because it was cramped in underneath a bunch of bureaucrats. I'm confident there's nobody on this platform, with the exception of me, who's ever read some of these economic directives that come out of Europe. They're nonsense. So there's a risk of staying in, there's a risk of going out, but the risk of going out, I believe, is less.
You can renegotiate better if you're at the table, possibly, Mario Monti, a lot of these regulations.
No. You can't renegotiate.
Well, hold on. I'm asking Mario Monti. He was there. He's seen it.
I was there. I was there rather to eliminate many regulations. It is true that there are too many and too detailed regulations, and we learned from the Brits that there is a name for this, which is silver plating, which is an obscure terminology to indicate that on top of the original proposal by the Commission, the Council and the Parliament, then each member state, the UK, I'm afraid, in the very first place, at the moment of transposing, because I try to be concrete, here there are nostalgic spirits around, which is a very nice thing, but I try to be concrete. At the moment of transposing a directive into national legislation, there is sudden, slightly protectionist-driven, business-inspired perfectionism, which complicates the directive more and more. But may I come back for a second to a proposition that I, in principle, admire of Lord Lawson. The UK is indeed the country that has the greatest global perspective, but I think the word leadership slipped into your language. I'm afraid that is the nostalgic element of it, because the UK is extremely helpful to all us to gain, because it has had so for centuries a global perspective. But the global perspective would be disarmed if it were held by a fairly small, highly distinguished, insular country, which, for example, in areas where the EU has deployed global leadership, like trade policies, like the fight against climate change, like competition policy. Can you imagine the deeply respected UK National Competition Authority to do what the European Commission, for all its bureaucrats, did, namely to say to GE and Honeywell 8 years ago, no, sorry, you cannot make this merger because the market would suffer too much, including in Europe. Well, one of the companies that was most grateful for that Brussels interventions was Rolls-Royce, I believe a British company, which felt that its role as a producer of aircraft engines would have been paralyzed by a combination between GE, Honeywell. Can you imagine, again, with all due respect, out of London, an authority to block a merger that had been authorized already by the Justice Department in the US and had the strong backing of President George W. Bush?
And Carolyn Fairbairn, we also had President Obama talking on trade, coming here and forcibly arguing the UK should leave the EU. So how do we know that the UK should stay in the EU?
Stay, yes.
But how do we know? This means that actually if the UK were to leave, then it would take 10 years to have some kind of trade deal.
Well, I think one of the really important points here, I think, is that there isn't a false choice here between being in the EU and being global. I think a lot of companies are slightly baffled by the idea that you can either be facing Europe or facing internationally. The fact is that having 550 million consumers that you can trade with absolutely no barriers enables you to be far more successful globally. And we have 55 trade deals internationally. And I think that President Obama was making an important point about the fact that the world is increasingly trading in regional blocks, and that the idea of there being 5 to 10 years of uncertainty, I think, is backed up in quite a lot of quarters now, and I think he was saying things that we've heard in many other places. Lamont?
Well, I think it's understandable why President Obama took the position he did, but the idea that there's a queue is one that's unknown in America. The US is negotiating several deals simultaneously, and it always has negotiated several deals simultaneously. So the idea that we would be deliberately put at the back end of the queue, I think, is not right, and President Obama won't be in office when it happens. Could I just go back to something you said earlier to Nigel, when you said, wouldn't we be weaker globally? Wouldn't we, because of the cumulative power of the EU? The EU may be good at trade policy, but the EU as a geopolitical player is quite hopeless. They can't agree on almost any foreign policy question, whether it be Syria, whether it be Iraq, whether it be recognition of Kosovo, the Falklands War. The idea that the EU is a geopolitical player is an illusion fostered in Brussels, but it is utterly unreal. And the whole problem with the EU is the very, very ponderous way in which decisions are made. Actually, we would be more effective making decisions on our own more quickly than rather going through this laborious process of trying to get the consensus of a very large unit.
Maurice Levy, a lot, and including a lot of the French politicians, want a reformed EU. So this is not that the UK wants to reform the EU and the rest of the Europeans are fine with the way it is.
I think that the only positive aspect of the Brexit discussion is that this is putting a light on all the issues the EU has. And I think we should not believe that the EU is perfect. EU has a lot of drawbacks, a lot of issues, and we should address those issues. And clearly there is a lot of red tape, there is a lot of regulations, incapability of making a few decisions from the political standpoint. And it is not by getting out of EU that you will be better off, and it will not help EU, it will not help UK. So I believe your role as a very important and highly respected country would be much better off inside the EU, transforming the EU, helping the EU, rather than outside the EU.
We do more trade with the rest of the world than we do with the EU, and the difference is growing. The proportion of trade we do with the European Union, although it's quite large, it's a minority, and it is a declining minority. The world is our oyster. And the problem, one of the problems with the European Union is that it has a democratic deficit and a bureaucratic surplus, and neither of those things are pretty good, very good. And as far as the British people are concerned, the democratic deficit is very serious, and this links with the regulation problem. There is far too much regulation which burdens small and medium-sized enterprises in this country enormously. And many of these small and medium-sized enterprises, incidentally, don't have anything to do with trade with the European Union, but they're still burdened with this regulation. Now, it's true that national governments also introduce regulations and get too entangled with it. But the difference is that we can get rid of bad regulations if they're British regulations. That is what the Thatcher government, of which I was a member, did. And the result one of the results of that was the British economy started doing far better. But if it's a European regulation, you're stuck. You can't do anything about it. It is there for good, and you'll never change it. And our influence within the European Union has declined considerably as a result of a decision we took not to be a member of the Eurozone, not to exchange sterling for the euro. Everybody in the CBI, incidentally, all said we'd be mad, we must go into the euro. We decided that we didn't want to, and I think even the CBI now admits that it was a big mistake to advocate that Britain should join the euro. But what this means now is that there is a Eurozone caucus within the European Union. It's our choice not to be part of it. I absolutely accept that. But we chose it, and I think it was the right choice. But we pay a price. We have much less influence because there's a Eurozone caucus now, which has an inbuilt qualified majority. And the ability of the United Kingdom to influence decisions in Brussels has greatly diminished as a result of our decision, which I think was a correct decision, not to be part of the Eurozone. So, but it comes back to the politics. Economically, we'll do fine. Fortunately, we live in a relatively free-trading world, policed by the WTO, which, incidentally, we can only reclaim our full membership of that if we leave the European Union, which the common external tariff of the European Union now is less than 4%. We can do very well, much, much better outside it, and we do not wish to be part of this political project for a political union, a United States of Europe. And since we don't want to be part of that project, Mario Monti would like to see a United States of Europe.
No.
Well, that is, you must declare that publicly. Will you declare that you're opposed to political union? Will you?
I don't see political union as a strict necessity, certainly not in the short and medium term.
No, but in the long term, that's what you're going for. And that's fair enough.
Thank you, my Lord spokesman.
But we don't want to be part of it.
Lord Lamont?
Well, I think there's a mythology about the single market, which is, and it's widely believed by businessmen, it's believed by the CBI, that you have to be part of it in order to sell to it. That, you know, these rule-making opportunities give you access. The fact is that many, many countries sell to the EU without being members. America actually sells more to the EU than we do. Switzerland, per capita, sells more to the EU than we do. Even when you look at services, the intra-trade in services within the EU is growing less quickly than EU growth of services to the rest of the world. And as Nigel said, our trade with the EU has dropped by 10 percentage points, from 54 to 44%. That is a dramatic drop and illustrates that the EU is a declining part. It is a slow growth region. Someone said it's like a walled garden. I think they should have added it's like a walled garden in which the trees and plants desperately need some water.
Carolyn.
But that's just not what most businesses are saying. They are saying that they really do value the fact that they have no tariff barriers within Europe and can trade very freely, and it enables them to trade more effectively with the rest of the world. So, you know, if you take
they wouldn't have those big tariff barriers anyway.
Under WTO rules, some of our most important industries, like the car industry, would have 10% tariffs.
Do you really believe that Germany, whose largest market for cars is the UK, is going to allow a 10% tariff to be imposed on British cars?
I think we have to be incredibly clear here. I think we need to really understand what the process of leaving would look like. And if you look at what happened with Article 50...
Do you think Germany would allow that?
It's not just up to Germany. There would be 27 countries.
Most things are up to Germany in the EU.
All of whom would have a veto. It's worth reading Article 50. I mean, it is a frightening read, because there are veto powers that every one of those 27... You know, Slovakia could veto.
Article 50 is not in the least frightening, because the amazing thing about Article 50, whether you want to use it or not, Article 50 about the process of withdrawal under Article 50 says that for 2 years, everything remains exactly as it is, and Britain participates in all decisions, except about the future.
But the clock is ticking at the end of those
2 years, everything is the same.
Monti, would you like to respond?
Yes. It's difficult to call authoritative British citizens to a bit of pragmatism, but I do. Democratic deficit. We know our democratic systems throughout Western democracies are in deep crisis. But, my Lord, if a British Prime Minister decides to appoint a cabinet minister, maybe even a cabinet minister not having been elected as a member of parliament, what sort of democratic scrutiny has that person to go through before taking office? None, if I am informed. The equivalent of a minister, a European commissioner, cannot be appointed by the President of the Commission, or at least the appointment will not be real and valid before there is an approval by the European Parliament, which, all due respect, is also a parliament, on the basis of written and oral examination conducted in total transparency throughout Europe. Also, pragmatism, please. We can always renegotiate with the US, etc. Let's not lose perspective here. We all in the world have entered a phase in which the appetite for openness, trade liberalization, etc., has plummeted down and down. Don't illude yourselves that with the US, for example, the queue is another thing, but quite apart from the queue, you would get easy and nice, in the Anglo-Saxon solidarity spirit, conditions, because the US is turning, like the rest of the world, more and more to closer and protectionism.
It's the European Union which has this protectionist tendency, I'm afraid, and this is one of the main reasons why President Obama wants us to stay, because he thinks it's in America's interest that we should stay, because we will be a liberalizing influence, he hopes, within the European Union, because the Americans are understandably concerned about protectionism in the United States, in the European Union, and in the European Union, and they're also concerned about a degree of anti-Americanism which there is in the European Union. The left in France, for example, has a profoundly anti-American streak. So he wants us to be trying to reduce the significance of that. But that's in America's interest. What is in our interest?
That would mean that the UK is a stronger and more valuable trading partner for the US.
No,
if
it doesn't.
The UK stays
well,
in the EU, that's what you're saying.
I am talking about not what is in the interest of the United States. It's for them to decide. I'm talking what is in the interest of the United Kingdom. And it's in the interest of the United Kingdom to regain our freedom and our democracy. Mario Monti, for whom I have a high regard, referred to democracy. Democracy is democracy, but you also did. And he suggested that we weren't really democratic, probably fully democratic, because ministers were appointed by the Prime Minister and not by the people. That's ridiculous. What democracy means is that if the people are fed up with a government, they can kick it out. And laws which have been passed, they can be changed by the subsequent government. You can't do that in the European Union. It doesn't happen. It's not possible.
I think he was talking about the House of Lords.
Well, he didn't say that.
June 1999, maybe Lord Lawson was not in Europe at that time. The European Parliament dismissed, i.e. sent home the executive, chaired the European Commission, chaired by Jacques Santer. So that can happen in Europe as well. I'm not saying the UK is not democratic. I'm saying that I don't see much reason for the UK to take a high moral ground vis-à-vis the young, imperfect, but rather flourishing new form of democracy that is the only form of democracy in a constellation of states that is there in the world. All the rest, many of the institutions to which the UK would like to continue to belong, the IMF, the WTO, etc., they are all very good. Of course, they are composed just of bureaucrats. But they don't have any form of democratic breathing.
Maurice, Levy?
Well, earlier Mario Monti said that he was not in favour of European political union. Now he's talking about the young democracy of the European Parliament. We all know what will happen as time goes by. The European Parliament will acquire more and more power. Britain has something like 10% of the seats in the European Parliament. It's something like 8% of the votes in the Council of Ministers. This is moving in the direction of political union. We are a very small part of it. And I do not believe that democracy can be exercised over 28 countries. There is not a European people in that sense. There is a French people, there is a British people, there is a German people, there is a Swiss people, even though they speak different languages. But you do not have a 28-country democracy. It simply cannot work. And we're getting more and more remote and more interventionist.
Maurice Levy.
Yes, I wanted to come back to the economical aspect because I think that when you are speaking about leaving Europe, you believe that things will stay as they are. And you mentioned that during 2 years they will stay and then things will go much better because you will be in the driving seat. I think that nothing could be more wrong than this assessment because you are simply forgetting one single aspect, which is the anger of all the European countries which will react. You believe that it's a soft belly, that Europe is really something which has very little strength and will not react and will just accept the consequences.
Well, this democratic institution, the European Union, is going to get angry because the people of one of its members, through a democratic election, decide to withdraw. That's a very poor advertisement for the European Union that exists in order to encourage friendship and cooperation.
Is it fair and democratic that 1 out of 28, that is the UK, is allowed to ask its citizens, whereas the 27 of us have to
the
absorb...
alternative to that is Britain is compelled to remain within the EU, whether its citizens want to or not. And the reason that they are angry and nervous about this is because they know very well that if Britain withdraws, there is a risk, I put it no higher than that, a risk that other countries will begin to think about it. That is for each country to decide. But I'm afraid I think it's a shameful argument to say that there would be anger. There ought to be respect for the vote of an individual country.
Well, we've heard
argument.
We've heard that from finance ministers.
I would like just to make my point very clear, because you are believing that all the countries will accept that things will go as if nothing has changed, if there is a Brexit. I think nothing could be more wrong than this, because people will protect their own country, they will protect their own businesses. This will be a fight, and it will be a tough fight, and you cannot believe that people will accept simply that you are putting at risk Europe and that you will continue to benefit from everything that Europe has given to UK. I think this would be wrong, simply.
Carolyn Fairbairn.
I do think getting back to this pragmatic case of what the alternative would look like really does matter. I think without necessarily talking about anger, free trade deals are really difficult to do. We know that. And what I just haven't heard, and I think our members say they haven't heard, is what the alternative would look like to the trade deals we have with Europe and those deals around the world, and why you are so confident that there will suddenly be a blossoming of free trade when we know it is incredibly difficult to do, and it will not be in the interest of several of our trading partners to do those deals with us.
I will tell you very briefly what the alternative to being in the European Union is. The alternative to being in the European Union is not being in the European Union. And it may surprise you, but most of the world is not in the European Union. And it may also surprise you that most of the world is doing a lot better than most of the European Union.
But not necessarily better than the UK, John Moulton.
Well, the UK is doing better than most of the European Union. It certainly is.
But also most of the rest of the world.
The fear arguments about trade agreements really are interesting. First of all, you actually would do quite well if we didn't get any fresh trade agreements.
No.
There wouldn't be that much impact. There'd be some. There'd be more impact on Europe if walls are put up than there would on the UK. You would lose more jobs in Europe if there was a brick wall between here and the EU. Than you would in the UK.
Why do you say that, John, given that only 10% of their trade comes to us and 50% goes the other way?
There's a difference in the sizes. I think the arithmetic might be a little misleading there.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is we have a trade deficit with them. Yeah, we have a trade deficit with them. The magnitude of the total is something like we would, on the face of it, and it's a terrible calculation, lose about 250, 270,000 jobs in the UK, and Europe would lose about 450,000.
Out of 500 million people. So
yeah, I don't think it makes any difference whether there's 200 trillion of the bloody people. The reality is there are people losing jobs. It would be stupid to do it. Can I just carry on for a second, please? The central thing about damage to the UK economy on leaving, which is the main argument, actually, that's being chucked up, is that the trade agreements will take forever to get sorted. They don't matter that much. That's a fair point. Next point is, why would it take longer than the Second World War for us to be able to get some reasonably functional trade agreements in place? We can. We've never had to do it in a rush. 2 years is a long time. We could get most serviceable agreements in place in that. We wouldn't get full agreements. We wouldn't get the stuff that deals with the levies on cans of pilchards or something sorted out.
Would you get passporting for the city financial institutions?
Get some passporting, I think. Don't know how much you'd get. That would be an argument. But again, but passporting isn't the end of all.
It's very important to every city institution I speak to. It's vital. It's one of the main reasons for being here.
It's a benefit to existing large institutions to have regulation, to have a standing position. It's not a benefit to the rest of the economy because it actually dissuades competition.
John, why would you take the risk? Is it really worth the risk? Because actually we don't really know what any trade agreement would look like or how anyone else would react.
Nobody can know the certainty of what comes out of this. Done nastily, we'll have definitely some kickback from people who are going rotten swines, the Brits. Actually, a lot of that will be, though, actually fear in the EU that there will be other referendums. They've not, for example, fixed the treaty when they broke it in style over the European bailouts, because they didn't dare risk the national referendums. There's a fear amongst the ruling class in Europe that there would be other referendums. Is it worth the risk of coming out? Yes, I think it is. The balance of probabilities is the future's better out than in.
That's right.
You live in a country where growth is something which only the older generation remember. It hasn't succeeded for you.
What? The European Union?
Yeah.
Well, the older generation remembers higher growth, as there was throughout the world, but also remembers huge deficits, which cost unemployment at the time to the future generations. The future generations are now there, so the fact of not having some fiscal discipline framework in a rather inventive and imaginative country and politics brought us to many bad things. And because you touched the point EU and Italy, I can assure you that if it were for original Italian legislative initiatives in the area of gender balance, anti-environment, anti-pollution legislation, and many, many other things, consumer protection, Italy, without the EU, would now be 30 years backward. But may I make another point?
Yes, and then Lord Lamont.
In many conversations I had, because there was an alternative, in many conversations I had, I was then Prime Minister, with David Cameron, George Osborne, and also in the House of Lords, the best part of which has joined us this morning. I believed forcefully the following case. The UK is more liberal-oriented, more lover of the single market, more lover of competition than the rest of us. We desperately need a greater influence of the UK in the EU policy process. By the way, I was Commissioner when the issue of the euro or not was put to the UK. I never spent one word to try and convince the UK to join the euro. Now I think it's a completely different story. And what I said to my then British colleagues was, if you started a crusade, a proactive crusade in Europe, by asking that the single market be really taken seriously, with the same instruments of enforcement that competition policy has, quick enforcement, rather than taking 3 or 4 years for an infringement procedure finally to be able to remove an obstacle created by member states to the single market. If you make 2 or 3, if we put 2 or 3 conditions to have a more open and competitive, broad single market, including for the digital, for the liberal professions, for services in general, you would put in great difficulty France, in some difficulty local Germany, not Berlin, but the Länder, etc., which are closer to a social market economy, but you would have an enthusiastic ring of allies from Northern Europe, from Central and Eastern Europe, from parts of Southern Europe, and you would be the winner of this transformation of the European Union, exactly like the Brits would like it to see. This was not done, and the nitty-gritty of things that are not very serious but can be sold to the electorate in order to persuade that the game has changed have been given the preference.
For our viewers and listeners, I would just like to reintroduce our panelists and then go to Lord Lamont, Carolyn Fairbairn and Maurice Levy. But I am joined from my left by Mr. Lord Nigel Lawson, Mario Monti, John Moulton, Carolyn Fairbairn, Lord Norman Lamont and Maurice Levy. Lord Lamont.
I just want to go back to Carolyn's point about trade and trade agreements, because Carolyn seems to regard trade as a form of warfare. Trade is actually for mutual cooperation. It's to everybody's advantage. People want trade deals. And the idea that it's very difficult to negotiate trade deals, I don't entirely accept. And I don't accept that it's necessarily easier through the EU just because of the size of the EU. If you look at small countries like Chile, like Singapore, like Korea, they've actually negotiated free trade agreements that are far larger, actually, than those of the EU. If you add up the GDP of the countries with which Switzerland has free trade agreements, it's much larger than the combined GDP of the countries with which the EU has free trade agreements. And furthermore, the free trade agreements of many countries outside the EU include, to some extent, financial services, which the EU's free trade agreements have not been able to do by and large.
See, I just don't think that is right. I think if you talk to people, who are negotiating trade deals, because they benefit consumers in the long run but damage producers in the short run who want to protect markets, they take a long time. You just have to look at this. So the TTIP deal is still, you know, it's been 4 years in the making and nowhere near conclusions. We know that the Swiss free trade deals with the EU took 16 years. The Canadian deal took 7 years. A strong vested interests that come out, and I think that is what we would see if the UK left the European Union.
Your examples were EU trade deals. You said the EU's deal with America, and then you said Switzerland, but you were referring to Switzerland negotiating with the EU. The fact that the EU takes a long time doesn't mean it has to take a long time.
The same is true of the TTP
deal. No,
this
is bureaucratic nonsense. Trade deals are helpful, but they're pretty piffling in the overall scheme of things. We do, in this country, we do an enormous amount and growing amount of trade with the United States. We have no bilateral trade deal with the United States at all. You don't need it. We live in a world of relatively free trade, policed by the World Trade Organization. I'm very pleased with that. And you don't need trade deals. You go, if anybody in this August Assembly goes shopping, you're probably all far too busy. But if you do, you don't just see goods from the European Union, you see goods from all over the world in the shops. There is no, there are many more important things than trade deals. And the regulatory problem is a huge problem, and it's particularly crippling for small businesses, which are not really represented by the CBI at all.
I mean, you were shaking your head when Nigel said they're in disbelief when Nigel said there are more important things than free trade deals. But the point that he is making is absolutely correct, that there are countries outside the EU that sell more and whose growth in exports to the EU is faster than that of Britain.
And
so trade deals can't be the overwhelming advantage.
Unless you get a worse deal if you get out of the EU.
No, well, you've made your position clear.
These countries have got no deal.
Maurice Levy.
I think that when you are speaking about this kind of issue, you will always find reason to stay or reason to leave, and you will build your case, and you are not listening to the key issues, which are what the people in Europe will feel about this. And as you said, there is something which is much bigger than trade, which is being or not being a big European continent. Even if you are in an island, and that we are now with the tunnel connected, and if you want to be part of this dream or not, and if you look at what Europe has been doing for the last 50 or 60 years, you see that there is a lot of issues which have been managed properly by Europe. We have avoided wars, we have been building a lot of things together. And I think that thinking solely about what UK can do and how UK can build a better deal than Chile or Singapore. Obviously,
no, it's not
your
about
dream
trade.
is
That's
to
right.
be Singapore. That's fine.
No, it is not.
And,
It's not about trade. Our perspective is that we wish to be a self-governing democracy with a global outlook.
But you are.
And we are hugely connected, which go in ways that have nothing to do with the European Union. The London is the most international city in the world. That is nothing to do with the European Union.
I would argue that without Europe, you would probably not have been this largest place that you are in the financial services in London.
No.
I would argue that without the support and without all the trade that you are doing with Europe, you would not be where you are today.
No, that's nonsense. But let me finish.
Yes, certainly nonsense.
Let me finish.
Because it's not
let me finish.
Going in your direction.
Let me finish, Monsieur Levy. We are also, on the non-economic side, probably the most important member of NATO, which is important for defence, after the United States. Okay, a long way after the United States, but the second most important. We have a seat on the we're a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. The Commonwealth contains a lot of the most exciting emerging world, not least India. We have connections of international connections greater than any other European country. So to talk about us as some island, okay, geographically we're an island, but somehow isolated unless we're part of Europe, that is nonsense. And the question is a political one. I wish the European Union well. You say it's a dream. It is a dream. But unfortunately, it has turned out rather closer to a nightmare. We wish our friends in France, and say, I live in France, I love France. We wish our friends in France and also in Italy certainly well. But we think that they're on the wrong track. If they want to go along that track, let them do so. But we want to choose our own destiny. That's what it's all about.
Mario Monti?
I've not heard a word on research. We know that research is a key driver of economic growth. There is at least one aspect where the EU is doing quite well, so well that much of its funds do go to British universities and research centres. And I wonder what would our British friends make of a UK out of the EU in this respect. And secondly and finally, everything I said, I want to stress this morning, is not whether Brexit would be in the interest of the EU or not. I tried, because I have been invited here in London, to put myself in the shoes of British consumers, companies, and even of the UK. Can I venture to say that there would certainly be some advantages, many disadvantages for the EU if the UK were to leave us, but there might also be one big advantage, which is not the one you are considering, namely no longer to have to deal with these rather difficult partners. But I, for one, would make the proposal the day after the UK leaves the EU that the EU should finally shift to one official language only, English, because so far it would have been unfair to select as the only official language the language of a large member state. And of course, Ireland would pocket a rent by doing so, but I believe that the dialogue with our UK friends would be even stronger, which would not make one bit easier, in fact, all the renegotiations that would have to be made, and do not underestimate their difficulty.
Lord Lamont?
Well, both Mario and our French friend have given the impression that if we leave...
The French is Maurice.
Maurice. Lovely name. The impression that by leaving the EU, we're going to drift off into the Atlantic and all cooperation is going to stop with Europe. I don't think that that need happen at all. For example, the military cooperation that Britain has with France, which is extremely valuable, and actually a lot of it outside the EU treaties, that absolutely would continue. And I think Europe would want to have some sort of military cooperation with Britain. If you take Mario's point about research, there are non-EU countries that collaborate in the research and development programs of the EU, to which we contribute through the budget. Switzerland makes a small payment towards the research budget and collaborates on research. We could participate in the Erasmus program. I don't think, for example, collaboration between European universities for 1 minute should cease just because we leave from the EU.
And also on research, the reason why the British universities are in the forefront is because, nothing to do with the European Union, is because we happen to have more of the generally agreed best universities in the world than in Britain than the rest of Europe has. That is why our universities attract research grants and indeed research students. So it's got nothing whatever to do with the European Union. What I do agree with is that one cannot be certain about the consequences of Brexit, but one cannot either be certain of the consequences of remaining in the European Union. The European Union is changing all the time. It's getting more and more integrated. The path to political union is getting more and more pronounced. And indeed, we know that your friend, President Juncker, and his 5 presidents report, which was published towards the end of last year, has as its goal the creation of a single European finance ministry with a single European finance minister by 2025. The fact of the matter is, as Jacques Delors fully understood, is that you cannot have a monetary union without a fiscal union, and you cannot have, in a democracy, a fiscal union without a political union. And if you don't want to go to political union, and you were a bit evasive about that, Mario, if I may say so, if you don't want to go to political union, then abandon the monetary union. But the monetary union does no economic good, it just does economic harm. Not least to your country.
Lord Lawson, we're just running out of time, so I want one more comment from Carolyn Fairbairn. Then everyone can submit questions through the app that we talked about before. Also, this is the right time to vote in the poll if you've changed your mind or if you want to have any new comments, and then I'll be taking questions from the floor. Carolyn.
I just want to raise a point which I think hasn't been raised yet, and that's about the importance of inward investment into the UK, which actually the UK is doing extraordinarily well in the European Union at the moment. It's probably going to be in the top 2 G7 countries in terms of growth for the 4th year in a row. We're doing really well. And one of the reasons is we attract foreign investment to this country, major multinationals who want to invest here. And they are very clear. 70% of them give membership of the European Union as one of the main reasons they are here, whether it's Nissan or Siemens or Veolia. And the idea that that would not be affected by leaving the European Union is not something that is supported by what multinational investors are saying. And in terms of jobs, growth and our future prosperity is a very important factor.
I unfortunately need to go to Q&A, but a lot of it will refer back just for our radio listeners and, of course, our TV viewers. We're talking about the implications for trade, business and regulation if the UK were to leave the EU. We're joined by 6 fantastic panellists, Lord Nigel Lawson, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, Mario Monti, former Italian Prime Minister and former EU Commissioner, John Moulton, founder and managing partner of Better Capital, Carolyn Fairbairn, Director General of the CBI, Lord Norman Lamont, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Maurice Levy, the CEO of Publicis. If we go to some of the questions that people have submitted, one very first one to Lord Lawson and Lord Lamont. This is from Luke Hickmore, Aberdeen Asset Management. Lord Lamont, what would make you change your view and cause you to stay in the EU?
I think it would require much more on the democracy front, much more return to national parliaments. One of the objectives that David Cameron set out in this very room was that he wanted power to go back to national parliaments, and that has not happened, I think, in any significant way as a result of the negotiation. I do not accept the legitimacy of the European Parliament. I do not believe there is such a thing as a European demos, a European popular will across 28 countries. I would want to see much more power given back to national parliaments.
Lord Lawson?
Yes, I agree with Norman. Two things, both of which he has touched on. First of all, in his Bloomberg speech, which you referred to right at the beginning of 2013, David Cameron said the European Union is profoundly unsatisfactory. It needs far-reaching and fundamental reform, those were his words, which then had to be embedded in a treaty. He then went into a renegotiation and got no far-reaching or fundamental reform. In fact, no reforms at all. A trivial amount of damage limitation. That was all. And the result is, I think he did his best, but it is clear that the European Union, in our terms, in the terms in which he set out, is unreformable. So that is that's got to change. The other thing that's got to change is the drive to political union. And the way that this could be seen is if the European Union were to abandon the single currency, which would be a great economic benefit to pretty well every member country of the European Union, with the exception of Germany. But if it were to abandon the single currency, and therefore, which is logical if you don't want to have a political union, the currency is the hallmark of a country. There are two things which are the hallmarks of an independent sovereign country. One is you have your own currency, and the other is you have control of your own borders. And within the European Union, neither is true. If they were to abandon the single currency, then I would have to reconsider my position. But I hoped for some time that they would, but it is clear they're not going to.
If you want to submit questions, now is the time. Also, if you are in the room and want to ask a question, just raise your hand, and we have microphones walking through the room. Mr. Monti, this is for you, and this is Fabio Bassi from JP Morgan saying, what is the risk of the EU turning into a less market-friendly area if the UK leaves the EU?
There is a risk in that direction, no question. And this is exactly the reason why I was firmly convinced that the way out should have been for the UK to take the lead within the European Union to make it more market-friendly. If I may, we hear that one of the reasons to leave the EU is to avoid the rather remote, in my view, risk of belonging to a political union. Is this so concrete as a risk that it might justify even the political disunion of the formerly United Kingdom that might derive from the separation of Scotland?
There's no connection between the two. The Scottish National Party has its own agenda. They're in favour of independence, so therefore they make this argument. But there is no logical connection whatever. And there's no reason to believe that the Scottish people will move in that direction, and indeed it would be irrational. Because if we were to leave the European Union, which I would hope, then the Scottish people would be Scotland would be in a very poor way, because if they don't remain within the United Kingdom, because they depend on the English market overwhelmingly, and they would not want any disconnection. There is no connection between these two things. That is just SNP propaganda.
But you would admit that Scotland too should have a democratic possibility to decide its future.
They are voting. They are voting. They're part of the Scots are part of the United Kingdom, and every citizen of the United Kingdom has a vote.
But they should decide also whether or not they like to continue.
Well, they did decide.
They did. They had in 2014. Yeah.
They
narrowly.
Also, the UK had decided
not
to join the EU.
It was a 10%
so
margin.
it's democratic to offer opportunities to reconsider.
Well, we can't have a referendum on EU membership in every town in the UK.
Let's take a question from the floor. Actually, a lot of questions that are coming in are about Scotland and the rest of the UK. We have one there in the middle. Gentlemen?
Yes,
Can you tell us who you are, if you stand up, who you are?
Sure, Richard Saldava, Investec Asset Management. I'll start off with a contentious question for the panel. Given a Brexit, to what extent do you think this spells potentially the end of the European project?
Who's that question to? The European project.
I'd like to hear, particularly from our continental European members of the panel.
So, if there is Brexit...
Is it the end of the European project? Sir, would you like to start? And then Lord Lamont.
I don't believe so. Also because I believe that the UK, which is a very pragmatic people, might in due course even reconsider whether it likes so much the splendid isolation out there in the cold.
Isolation?
In insulation, maybe, out there in the cold. But certainly the European project has many tensions concerning it, quite apart from the UK, which should not elude itself of being the only problem of the European Union. And I believe the European Union is going through many tensions essentially because in all of our countries democracy is going through many tensions, increasing short-termism, inability to think long. Political leaders turned almost without exception into political followers of opinion poll, selling a referendum like this, pre-announced 3 years ago from here, as something that would be in the national interest, whereas it was, as has been said, a device to advance the strength of a personal political position. So obviously the EU, which has 28, maybe 27 such democracies, has its own very severe problems. Because one common feature of this degeneration of our democracies, of which the UK is quite a significant example, is that international integration suffers more and more. That's why I would warn the UK not to be very optimistic about this new bonanza of international trade agreements facing it.
Lord Lamont?
I believe that if there was a vote to leave the EU, that might be the one way in which you could actually save the EU. I think it would cause them to think again, cause them to think about reform. It might actually usher in some change in the EU, make it less intrusive, less in favour of integration for the sake of integration. That's what's fundamentally wrong with the EU. It's all about integration for the sake of integration. And if actually public opinion democratically gave them a bit of a shock, I think they might think about the shape of the whole project all over again, and it would be very good for Europe.
Maurice Levy, and then
I may agree with you. I may agree with you, but this is not a reason to wish that UK is leaving. I don't wish to see the Brexit happen, and I believe that what is happening currently is something which is already a wake-up call for Europe. And I believe that you staying within Europe, you can help dramatically changing the way things are happening in Europe. I'm a European citizen, I'm French, and as you mentioned, I don't like a lot of things in France, and I don't like a lot of things in Europe, and I believe that there is a lot of reforms that have to happen. These reforms are taking too much time, and sometimes I agree there is too much bureaucracy in Europe, and we are stalled simply because it's difficult to get 28 countries getting together and agreeing. But at the same time, there is something which is much bigger than all these issues, and I think that building a far better Europe is something in which you can contribute greatly.
Carolyn, hold on. Carolyn, do you want to?
If we do get a vote for out, We're faced with the joys of the treaty and the Article 50 and all that stuff. I don't think you can discount the original Boris theory that we would actually find very rapidly that a different deal with Europe was on the table, which could be advantageous to both the UK and to Europe, because it would serve as a catalyst for actually getting Europe into better shape. So there is a potential there that you'd get a vote for out, a much more sensible deal agreed with Europe, and we change our minds and stay in, and everybody's happier and better off. It's rather a nice prospect. Can't guarantee it, but it'd be nice to have.
We have time for 2 more questions, unfortunately. Let's go to the gentleman there on the right.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Quijano from Commerzbank. I have 2 quick questions. With all due respect to the seniority of the panel, why do you not have somebody who's under the age of 30 in the panel? This is, after all, about the future of Europe, and many students have benefited greatly from the openness of Europe, whether in the UK and Europe. Second quick question. I'm shocked. I'm shocked by the fact that you've only focused on the monetary and trade aspects of Brexit. This is talking about the EU. You have not focused on the EU as a peace project, why it was founded in 1955 as a peace project. We need to look at the future of the European Union. Without the United Kingdom, the European Union is quite lost.
Do you have a question? Is it a question?
The question, the second...
I talked about the panel, and we talked that this...
The 2 questions were, why do you not have somebody who's under the age of 30 in your panel? And the second question is, why did you not address the question about EU as a peace project?
Let's take another question, because we will address it one-on-one afterwards. Sir.
Yeah. Good morning, Carolberto De Casa from Active Trades. I wanted to ask to Mario Monti what could be the impact of on the exchange rate of a possibly deal of the Brexit and no Brexit. So what could happen to the British pound against euro and the British pound against the sterling? And what could be the impact on the British GDP? Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. We've just been warned that we have discussed too much these slightly irrelevant topics. No,
So it would be interesting to have your answer. Thank you.
I believe there will be a huge unpredictability, which of course is loved by those making work and money in the foreign exchange markets. So that's all for the good, speaking in London. A London, however, which will be, I fear, shrinking gradually because of these uncertainties and because eventually of the exit from the European Union. The euro is there to stay. So many bad things happened within the eurozone, but no one can legitimately speak of a euro crisis. We have lived through very difficult, and I can testify to this, financial crisis within many members of the eurozone, but the euro has been unimaginably strong since its very beginning, and sometimes too strong, European producers would say.
Lord Lamont?
I just wanted to comment on the point about peace. I think this is a complete myth that is the EU that has created peace in Western Europe. It is NATO that has kept peace in Europe, and of course we live in a completely different world in which people travel, in which there is trade. There would be trade even without the EU. There is a lot of tourism, there is global media. It is not the EU that has brought about this happy condition. The one opportunity that the EU had to bring peace was in the Balkans and in Yugoslavia, where the EU made a complete mess of it. And in its vanity, do you remember Mr. Jacques Proust, the EU External Foreign Affairs spokesman, said at the beginning of the Balkans crisis, the Yugoslav crisis, he said, "This is Europe's hour, it is not America's hour." And what happened? They made such a hash of it, America had to come in and clear up the mess that was left by Europe.
Carolyn, hold on.
I actually just want to pick up on this point about economic shock and actually link it to the point about young people, because I think they're related. I mean, this point about there being a shock if we were to leave, I think actually there's almost consensus on that. Even Gerald Lyons, who works for Boris, confirms that. And just linking it to this point about young people, I couldn't agree more with that point about the under-30s. I have 3 of them. I'm not one myself, but I have 3, and I know what they think and I know what they care about. They are instinctively confident about a future within the European Union, and it's partly about jobs. I mean, this is a generation who only 6 years ago went through the financial crash, faced unemployment coming out of universities and schools. And are we really going to do it again? Are we really going to inflict another downturn, another short-term recession for some totally unproven sunlit upland of trade deals that we have no idea what they might look like? So I think these are 2 very important and very connected points.
We're unfortunately running out of time, so I'm going to ask you in almost 10 seconds, actually, come the referendum, what people should be thinking about in the booth. Lord Lawson.
What people should be thinking about is, what is the European Union about? The European Union is about a political venture which we don't wish to be part of. It brings no economic benefit net to the European Union itself. The European Union is one of the slowest growing countries in the world, with one of groupings in the world with one of the highest levels of unemployment, which is very sad. So it is a political project which we do not, the British people do not wish, and indeed the French don't either. But of course France is an elitist country. It's the elite who run it. Yeah. But I was very interested in a poll in Le Monde about 3 weeks ago, where the French people were asked, would you like to have a referendum like the British people have so that you could leave the European Union? And 53% of the French said yes.
There will be huge queues of people thinking. A short comment on really only what people need to think on that day in the booth.
I would think, as a British citizen, do I really have much greater confidence in the political class in the UK than I have generally, and would I feel comfortable in having this political class leading me and my fellow UK citizens in the rather untested and perilous adventure of going against the wind at a time when countries try to combine rather than to pursue nostalgia through this integration.
John Moulton, quick comment.
Largely, I won't add to what the peer to my right said. He's on target. If I was a young person, and I wish I was, the one thing I would pick up in the EU is the level of youth unemployment, and decide on balance I might prefer something else.
Carolyn Fairbairn.
I think that it is about what's best for the next generation, what will create the best career paths, prosperity, opportunities within the UK globally, and that's what should be in the minds of all of us, even those of, and perhaps especially those of us over 30.
Lord Lamont.
Well, it is about what is best for the young people and where are the opportunities, and it is about where are they globally. And Europe is a sclerotic, failing, slow-growth economy. We're better to have the freedom to find new markets in the world and take back control politically of our own affairs.
Maurice, Levy.
I think that the British people are benefiting today of being inside and outside of Europe, and that we should not make any mistake. They are inside because they are part of the EU, and they are outside because there are a lot of things that they have elected not to be part of, like Schengen and like the Eurozone. So therefore, they are benefiting of the best of the 2 worlds, and I would invite them to think what it is to live one of the good worlds.
Thank you so much for a great discussion. Thank you for our panelists and also our great audience.
Difficult to talk over the peers, isn't it?